And it says here, I love this one, is 10% of the US population has shoplifted or actively shoplifts. So 1 out of 10 of us in this room, you're already a thief, okay? But hey, we are so glad that you are here today. It is beautiful weather outside, and man, it is just an awesome time to be here and see what God is doing. And man, as we jump into this, we're continuing our study through the 10 Commandments. And I was thinking about this week, is like how all this is gonna go. And I'm like, I've been trying to struggle through this passage a little bit, and I'm like, I don't know what direction to go. And then I started thinking about my Sunday, and all I have to do, I gotta watch football. I gotta come back. Yeah, that's an important part of it, right? I gotta come back tonight, and I'm gonna, hang out with some youth kids, and it's gonna be fun. But I'm like, in between that, right after service, we're gonna go get lunch. And chances are, if you know my family, where are we going? That's ridiculous, okay? The fact that you know that, that's just... But here's what's difficult. Even going to a place like Culver's, we don't go to real restaurants, right? Because we got 3 kids, 7 and under, and we got a 4th kid coming in March. And when we go to a place, here's what it is. Like, we're getting our drinks, we're getting ketchups, we're getting sides, we're putting everything out. We're telling kids to sit down, stop jumping up, telling Arlo not to break your head open because he's 2 and crazy. And as we're doing all this, we're getting all the food out. And then we finally have it, and then I look up, and this happens more often than not, mine and my wife's drinks are right next to each other. And here's the question I ask. Is that mine? And if you're a normal person, you don't use the little buttons on top of the lid, so you got no idea, right? And I'm like, which one is which? And here's the problem, is my wife drinks diet and I don't. And so diet is disgusting when I drink that, okay? So the only way to tell is to drink one of them, and then really quickly I know, is that mine or no, that ain't mine. As we come to this 8th commandment today, that is exactly the question that really answers, are we following it? Because today we are talking about stealing. And this is maybe, I would argue, the most simple, basic, straightforward of all the 10 commandments, but still we find ways to screw it up. But really it's just asking this question of, is that mine? And if it is not, then do not take it. But we talk about this all the time. We personally, our world at large today and throughout history is a bunch of grown-up toddlers that when we are given directions, we find ways to mess it up. And today we come to commandment number 8. We're going to be in Exodus chapter 20, verse 15, and we're going to be jumping all over today. But in Exodus chapter 20, looking at verse 15, it says very easily, very simply, it tells us not to steal. And it says this in verse 15, do not steal. You see, it's not really complicated. It's not very hard. It's not this like overwhelming concept that should take us a lot of time to figure out. It is literally the most basic commandment and the most straightforward, no gray areas, I would have say, of all of them. Throughout this series, if you've been with us, these previous 7 commandments we've talked about, a lot of these are complicated. When you talk about adultery, you say, yeah, like I'm good at that. And like I'm not good at not adultery. I'm good at not committing adultery, okay? I hope is what you're saying. And then you get into it and you read Jesus' words, you're like, oh, I'm not as good of a person as I thought I was. You see murder and you're like, definitely haven't done that one. Got no bodies buried in the back of my backyard. And then Jesus is like, yeah, that dude you flipped off on the highway, yeah, you murdered him in your heart. You're like, ooh, that one stings a little bit. But when we come here, and he says, do not steal. This is one, it's like, okay, I haven't taken anything from. There's really not a deeper meaning that we're going to talk about today. That is the definition of do not steal. Actually, if you go to the Hebrew, it is this. It says, it means to take items without permission by the owner. And usually the caveat it adds on to this is by stealth and not force. You see, when we hear that, we say like, yeah, I don't do that, or I haven't done that, or I know when I mess up, but I know not to do it. But here's the deeper thing that I think we need to struggle with today is what is the impact when we do mess up? Because that's the big deal of this command, that stealing has a negative impact beyond sometimes what we think about. And here, this is going to be the first point that you see on your notes, is that stealing has a negative impact because it not only robs the owner of their possession, that's the one we know really well, but here's this, it also robs the thief of the process. You're like, what? We're going to get into that. It robs the thief of the process. You see, this is a little deeper, a little more complex from how the reverberating impact that comes out when we do something so simple like take something that is not ours. And it all of a sudden has this rippling effect that not just affects us personally, but it can affect other people as a whole and affects our spiritual relationship with God. You see, as we talk about and come to this topic, stealing is something that really has gotten out of control. There's statistics, and you can find a statistic for anything. So I just, Google statistics until it makes my point, and then I use that statistic. I don't know if you can trust any of them, but you can trust the ones I give you to make my point, okay? Just hear that. But here's what it says is that you think about just our current culture and how it's got out of control is that shoplifting is America's #1 property crime, according to this website. But here's what it says, that more than, they kind of, project, they think that more than 500,000 occurrences of shoplifting happen every single day. That's crazy, but if you've worked in of our cities. So when anyone says Phoenix isn't a top 10 city, you prove them wrong, okay? We're top 10 in something, whether it's a good thing or not. We're also #1 in inflation, so take that, rest of the country, as we talk about giving later in this sermon. But here's the deal of all this, is that you can throw stats after stats of how bad this is, but it doesn't even begin to scratch the impact that stealing has on the world around us and us personally. And the first part of this that I want to look at today is the impact of stealing the process. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 28. Like I said, we're going to kind of jump from, passage to passage all over the place here today. But it says this, let the thief no longer steal. Instead, he is to do honest work with his own hands so that he has something to share with anyone in need. Did you hear that? Paul is writing this and he says, hey, the one that is stealing, stop stealing. And instead he's saying, instead work with your hands so that you have something to give out. As I said before, it's like this week is going to be a little different because usually we try to land in some passages and really pick it apart. But the Bible kind of like drops little truths about stealing all over the place. But it's really hard to kind of like wrap it up in like a couple different passages. So we're going to kind of bounce around some here. But here we're going to see in this first point that we kind of are pulling from here is it's focusing on that when someone is a thief, they don't just rob other people, but they're truly robbing themselves. You see, what Paul, the writer, is saying is that when we are stealing, what we are not doing is honest work. And when we are not doing honest work, there is something that we are missing out on that we could be experiencing in a bigger degree. This past week, we decided to buy, when I say we, my wife, right? She saw this online. She's like, I really need this Sam's Club playhouse for our kids, okay? It's like all wood. I told her, I'm gonna need a tarp for this because it's gonna make it 2 summers and it's gonna be a pile of rubble, right, from the sun. But she's like, the kids need a new and better one. And I'm like, fine. So I get a box and it's like 80 different pieces of wood and then a bunch of screws and stuff. It was pretty easy to put together when you follow the directions, but it's like find #1, and I'm like, I found 10 through 80, but I can't even find #1 yet, right? Like I never checked to see if I have all my supplies. I actually had to lay them out. It was very annoying in this project. But after I take most of my Saturday to like build this whole house and everything, as I like stood back and looked at it, I was like, man, I just built a house. It was shorter than me, but it was still a house, okay? I can't stand up inside it. But it was cool to see and look and be like, that thing looks beautiful. And then to see my kids run inside and play in it, there was something special about, I built this with my hands. And I get to pass it on and give it to my kids who are enjoying it. And right off the bat, here we see a timeout. And the Bible warns us that when we steal, we circumvent that process. Instead of working for something, instead of putting our hand to the plow, we take something that doesn't belong to us, we claim it as our own, and we're missing the process, the hard work that it took to get there. So let me give you 3 quick kind of follow through, some fallout of this when we talk about what is the impact when we kind of rob that process, circumvent that process. The first thing is it creates entitlement. We've heard story after story in the public sphere of that celebrity kid or, son of an athlete who grows up and is an absolute jerk. Because they had everything handed to them their whole life. And it's like their parents forgot all the stuff they went through to get to their point. Instead, they just I'm going to give my kids everything I didn't have. And they also didn't give them the hard work that they developed. And there's this entitlement that comes, and the same thing happens when we circumvent it with stealing. Is we start taking things that are not ours, and then instead of working up and slowly seeing I had to pay a price to get this, instead we set our eyes on bigger things. And say, I want that as well. I want to take this because I want it. I deserve it. Not that I actually worked for it, but I think that I deserve it. And that entitlement just brews and brews and brews. The second thing it does, it also creates laziness. There's a teacher that when her kids came in, they had a special assignment, and she said, hey, you need to come up with 3 words to describe yourself. And the first kid that comes up, she's like, okay, Johnny, what are your 3 words? And he said, lazy. Did you get it? That's all he said, okay? He missed the next 2 words on it, okay. But it's there's this laziness that can come and can breed inside of us. And when we start getting things that we don't work for, and all of a sudden we have less and less motivation to actually work for things. I can just find a shortcut that I can get that thing. Because the real way is a lot harder. The real way just seems like so much work and time. Why don't I just cut that process a little shorter? And the last thing we see out of this is it creates anarchy. Man, look at our world today. Over the past couple of years, we have seen and I'm not making a political statement in any way. I'm just literally making observations. We've seen protests that have come throughout our big cities. And that's okay to protest. That's okay to talk. But when it gets a little crazy, is when businesses are all of a sudden getting broken into, and that protest becomes a looting party. The kids have a loot box now as something that's cool. When it's looting in real life, it's not as cool, right? It's breaking windows and taking everything you want because you think it's free. And here's what happens is when that mentality gets into a crowd, it quickly gets out of hand really fast. And we see it goes from kind of having a conversation, having an open protest, having a logical flow of thoughts of speaking out against something to just mass anarchy and craziness. And you see all this stems, you see how when we decide we're going to steal something, when we decide we're going to take something, we are cutting a process that not only hurts the other person, but that hurts the thief personally. In ways they don't even understand. And you may be nodding along and saying yeah, that's right. Those punks, they should feel bad. They should be messed up. But we're going to get into how you do this as well. But just because we see the impact on the thief doesn't mean it lessens the impact at all of the one who is stolen from. Because we also, as we continue, we see the impact of stealing the possession. Leviticus chapter 6, starting at verse 2, it says this, and the Lord is speaking to Moses. He says this, that when someone sits and offends the Lord by deceiving his neighbor in regard to a deposit, a security, or a robbery, or defrauds his neighbor, or finds something lost and lies about it, or swears falsely about any of the sinful thing a person may do. You see, God just took stealing, and he's giving commentary on stealing. He's saying all these things in verse 2 or 3 are stealing, okay? So he says, if you do all of this, all right, verse 4, he says, once he has sinned and acknowledged his guilt, Listen to what he must do. He must return what he stole or defrauded, or the deposit entrusted to him, or the lost item he found, or anything else about which he swore falsely. He will make full restitution, meaning he will pay it all back. He'll make it whole for it and add a fifth of its value to it. He is to pay its owner on the day he acknowledges his guilt. Verse 6, this is where we'll stop. It says, then he is to bring his guilt offering to the Lord, an unblemished ram from the flock according to your assessment of its value, as a guilt offering to the priest. You see, God makes very clear in Leviticus here is he kind of expands upon the 10 Commandments. And that's what kind of the rest of the law, if you see in the Old Testament, is the 10 Commandments are like the big 10, right? That's why we call it that. But then after that, he expands upon it in more detail. And he kind of gives specific examples of how this would naturally go into the nation of Israel. But here, as he expands upon it, he talks about that stealing hurts other people a lot. And that is why here God puts consequences, and here's what you need to do when you do commit this sin. That there are consequences for that, and you got to make people whole because of the mistakes you are making. And from a very practical sense, here are 3 kind of real ways that when we steal from other people, and we take their possessions from them, this is the ways it can hurt. The first thing it hurts is it hurts personal relationships. Think about this, for example. Have you stolen from someone close to you? And if you have, did it impact your relationship? And maybe as you're thinking, you're like, I can't think of a time. Well, here's your challenge or your homework for the rest of this week is go steal from a really close friend or from your spouse. And then wait a few days and tell me how it goes. It's not going to make your relationship better, especially when we talk about stealing is usually in quiet and is like there's a stealthy aspect to it. When you steal from someone, it does a few things. One, they are out that item. But here's the other thing that we don't like to think about is when it's someone close to you, you are breaking their trust. So not only is there a physical component like, bro, you stole money from me, now I don't have that money. There's like this trust of like, now I can't trust you anymore. Because I don't know what you're going to do. And when we steal from people, it hurts our personal relationships around us. When people steal from us, we got to hold that at a distance and be like, I don't know, bro. Like, I let you into my house and you burned me. I don't know if I can do that again. But you see, it doesn't just hurt personally. It also hurts employment relationships. I have another few fun stats for you here. According to the employee screening company Guardsmark, employee theft costs more than $120 billion a year. If that's even half that amount, that's still a wow. You guys don't care this morning. You hear billion and you're like, that's just a big number, right? That's a lot of money, okay? But here's, as it continues, and it talks about there are so many different ways people steal. According to the U.S. Today, 48% of U.S. workers admit to taking unethical or illegal actions to their employer in the past year. You're like, 48%? That's half of us. Think about this for a second. And some of the ways this could include is like cheating on an expense account, is paying or accepting kickbacks, is secretly forging signatures, of buying personal items, of stealing company supplies, and the list goes on and on and on. You took those pens you weren't supposed to, or that box of pens that just fell on your desk. That's stealing, right? This past week, I actually went to Sam's Club and I was doing a pickup order. And as they were loading my stuff up, I was like, I saw something. I was like, I don't think that's part of my order. Like it was like these Pop-Tarts. Like I ordered all this different food and half the time I don't know what's coming because my wife orders and I just pick it up. But it was like all these Pop-Tarts and there's like 15 of these Sam's Club sized boxes of Pop-Tarts. And she was just loading them into my truck or in my car. And I'm like, that ain't mine. And she's like, nah, I think they are. So I like pulling up the receipt as this like, 100-pound girl is loading like $300 worth of groceries in my car. I'm like, I got something to do. But then finally I stopped and I was like, those aren't mine. And she was just going to give them to me. And that would have been like employee maybe accidentally stealing and giving me all this stuff. And I should have just took them and sold them like, for $1 cheaper in the parking lot. Could have made money. Literally the conviction was, you are preaching about stealing this week. You cannot take these. I don't audibly hear the Holy Spirit much, but I think that was one of those moments I was like, I got you, God. All right, I'll put this back. But there are so many small ways this happens. And think about this from a company perspective. When you steal or someone else's steal, it does two things. One, you are literally hurting the company because you are hurting their bottom line. I used to work in HR and retail. I understand how this works, okay? But two, you might be hurting your relationship with your job. One, if they find out, guess how hurt your relationship is going to be? It's probably going to be severed. And two, you either have animosity towards that company or they eventually will have it towards you. And the last part of this that we see, and I would say the most important part, is it not only hurts our personal relationship, our employment relationships, but it hurts more than anything our spiritual relationship. Malachi chapter 3, verse 8, it says this, will a man rob God? Yet you are robbing me. How do we rob you, you ask? And this is how God responds. He says, by not making the payments of the tenth and the contributions. You are suffering under a curse, yet you, the whole nation, are still robbing me. He says, bring the full tenth into the storehouse so that there may be food in my house. Test me in this way, says the Lord of armies. See if I will not open the floodgates of heaven and pour out a blessing for you without measure. You know, one of the things we don't like to think a lot about is we think on the surface, okay, stealing something that doesn't belong to me. We think about the people around us. We think about our jobs. We think about our world, those that are close to us. But we often don't think of how we steal from God. But here's the deal. Stealing, as we said, is taking something that does not belong to you. And what we just talked about throughout the service is the songs we sang, the prayer we pray to prepare you to feel guilty later about this, is that everything belongs to God. So when God gives us something and we hoard it all and we say it is all ours, what we are doing is we are stealing from him. And this can be our time. It can be our talents, and in a big way, it can be our money. And so often we get wrapped up and say on the flip end of like, I have worked hard for all I have. I have built this all myself. I have done everything. I work this many hours a week. I have earned this. I have done this. I have done this. I have done this. And God is laughing and be like, bro, you wouldn't have anything if it wasn't my hand that gave it to you. And in Malachi 3:8, we see this idea of that we have stolen from God. Now, what does this mean? And let's break this down for a second. It's like, what does it mean to give back to God in the right way? And we'll get a little more detail in here. But first, I kind of want to address something because here they make this idea of a tenth they reference here. And if you've grown up in church, and we don't actually talk about this a ton, is like you used to call giving a tithe. Because it was a set in the Old Testament. You see that tithing is 10% of what you have, you give back. Now, a lot of people debate theologically. Do you give on the gross? Do you give on the net? I'm like, do you give? Okay, that's really the question now that we ask. And honestly, a lot of people give 0%. Some people give 2%. Some people give 5%. I'm not even wrapped up on the percentages. What we need to ask, are we giving anything? And are we giving in a way that flows from our hearts? Because honestly, it doesn't even matter as much the amount. You should be giving something, but you should be giving continually, you should be giving regularly, and you should be giving in a way that stretches who you are instead of hoarding everything for yourself. And here, this is exactly what God is referencing at, is he's saying the people were stealing from God. They were stealing from him because he gave them something to set up. He said, hey, give this back to me. And they said, I don't think I can live on 90%, so I'm going to hold more back for myself, God. And when we get into that mindset of, God, I can't give you anything. It's just a really hard time right now. And then all of a sudden times get better. And it's like, God, I know it's a little bit better, but I still can't give it. And why? Because we learn to live off of more and more and more and more. And we kept keeping that back from our God. But here's where this starts to get good, because then Malachi kind of turns the corner here. First, he starts and says, you are stealing from God. And I love this, is he asks, like, how can you expect a blessing? Now, this is where a lot of prosperity, crazy teaching comes. You don't give, so you get. But I guarantee you, if you give, God will start to bless you, even if it might not be financially in the form of a jet ski that shows up on your front porch, right? We all wish. But he will bless you in ways you can't imagine. But then on the flip side of this, instead, they start to allude and says, Malachi counters it. He says, but the way to stop this is instead to give it away. And it's to start having this heart of generosity automatic where it just comes out and goes straight to the church, so I don't have to think about it. I can't be angry about it. I can't be happy about it. It just goes, and then I'll think about it later, right? And then I can rejoice in my prayer life. But God says, I don't want you to give out of spite. I don't want to give you out of anger, but cheerfully, willingly, knowing that you are giving back to God your time, energy, and talents because it is doing something for the kingdom. And we don't give because we are obligated to. We give because God has given us so much. And by that gift, we are transformed, and then we want to give that back to other people. Man, I know a lot of generous people in my life. And I will say the most generous people I know might be just random coincidence, are followers of Christ. But even those who aren't, that I know that are generous givers, here's kind of the thing they have in common, is people who are generous and who give a lot know how much people have given them. And when it comes to followers of Jesus, they are the most generous in that because they know how much God has given to them. Too often we are selfish and we don't want to give other people because we're standing on third base and we think we hit a triple instead of we hit a single and we got bunted over twice, okay? If you didn't get that reference, go watch some baseball, all right? But we are generous when we realize and we reflect on the fact that God has been so generous to us. Let me give you 3 quick things that happen when we start to make this turn and we start to turn towards and we see that generosity is the way and not hoarding and not being selfish and not stealing, but actually giving things away. The first thing that will happen as you become a generous person is that working becomes joyful. Now, when I first wrote this, I think I was inspired by the Holy Spirit because then I read it later and I was like, what was I thinking when I wrote this? Like, working becomes joyful? Like, what are we talking about? No, but there's some truth in that. When you start working in a point where it's not just about getting things to build my kingdom, of grinding so I can get this next thing, but if you start working and you start seeing faces of other people, of how you can make the world a better place, you're going to enjoy that work more. In that job that you feel like you hate at times, when all of a sudden you picture your beautiful family, when you picture your church family, when you picture the nonprofits in your community and you say, I get to help these things because of what I'm doing, you are going to hate that job less. And it starts to have this joy. And if you still hate that job, get a new job. Okay, that'd be if you're generous and you still hate your job, you need a new job. But all of a sudden there's this turn that starts to happen. If it's not just out of anger and out of spite and out of like, I have to do this, but I get to do this, and God is using me to bless things in my world. But not only that, not only does working become joyful, but here's the not fun part, is budgeting becomes necessary. Oh, you can walk out now, I understand. These things are a lie. First, address money. We say all the time is that we have no money. But guess what? If you live in America, you have more money than like 99% of the world. It's a lie from Satan when you say, I got no money to give. You do. You just spend it stupid if you got none of it, right? There's this thing called budgeting, of telling your money where you want it to go. And here's the thing, is the world will gladly tell you where to spend your money. When it is just reckless, it will say, you need to go order DoorDash. You need to do this. You need to buy that new TV. You need to spend money on this. I need another Sun jersey, whatever it is. When we are not intentional, the world will tell us how to spend our money. It is a lie, but the second lie is when we say we're too busy. We don't have enough time to give to God. Did you know, this is a statistic I found, that you have the same amount of time as every other human on this planet? That one's true, all right? I actually looked that one up and I confirmed it. That maybe you get more or less sunshine, right? That's why we live in Phoenix. We get more sunshine than most. But you have the exact same time as everyone else in the world. And when we say we're too busy, what we're saying is we prioritize things. And you should prioritize. But so often we prioritize wrong. Is we get to choose, what do I spend my time and energy on? Do I prioritize my relationship with God? Do I prioritize my time with my family, with my friends, with my church family? And then do I pour into myself to making myself better? Instead, we prioritize and we give our time away to things that we think might matter in the moment, but when we look back and be like, that didn't move the ball. You see, budgeting becomes necessary in order for us to be generous, in order for us to radically do this. And here's the last one, is that saving becomes purposeful. Saving money is a good thing. And I will say it is a great thing, especially in our world today, because we do not do a good job of it. But I will also say, saving needs to have a purpose. My wife and I have been married almost 10 years, and during that 10 years, when we first got married, I opened retirement accounts for both of us. I had already had mine before we got married, and I opened these, and I still contribute to these regularly because I knew God called me to ministry, so I wouldn't have a pension or a 401k at the end of time. You know, I'll have a house in heaven, but I might not have one after I'm done preaching on earth, right? Because I make money. But so I opened those, and I've given to those faithfully for all the years. We've budgeted around it. And here's the thing, though, as I've thought about this, is like, why do I want to save money for retirement? Is it so I can go like on Cabo on a beach and just chill out and like, you know, be on a beach the rest of my life when I retire? That sounds nice, but no. I save for a couple of reasons. One, I save so that I'm not a burden to my children when they grow up and they don't have to pay for me. But instead, I can be financially free of me and my wife, and we can make sure set up them for success. But also, I want to retire one day and have money so I can be generous with it. So that it just doesn't build my kingdom, that I don't hoard my stuff, but I can be a radical giver now and in the future because I am saving money for a purpose. And too often we can get wrapped up into doing things for all the wrong reasons. We take money, we hoard money, we keep all this because we think that we need it. But what we don't realize is when we're stealing our time and our money from God and the rest of the world, it hurts us. It has an impact like we don't understand. It hurts the world around us, but it also prevents us from doing what God has for our lives. And here's the bottom line I want to leave you with today. Is as all this is kind of floating around your head, is like, how do I attempt to apply this? How do I kind of put this into words? Like, what is my next step for me? And here's what I want you to hear, is that when working replaces stealing, we can be generous to our world with what God has generously given to us. Let me say that again, because I know that's a mouthful. And you can write that down in your notes. But when working replaces stealing, right? When we take stealing off the map of saying, I'm not going to steal from God. I'm not going to steal from my work. I'm not going to steal from the people around me. Instead, I'm going to work my butt off. And when that honest work replaces that stealing, here's what we get to do, is we get to be generous with the things that God has given us. We get to be generous to our church, to our families, to our communities, and we get to give our time, our resources, our energy, and we get to give it for building up his kingdom and not our own. I think a perfect example we see in scripture of this is Jesus has an encounter in Luke chapter 19. And you probably have heard this story if you've been in church before. But this is a story of a man named Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus, we know, was a wee little man. But Zacchaeus was also loaded. He was a chief tax collector. He was the boss of the tax collectors. You think our government officials are corrupt now? It was nothing like, it was a whole nother ballgame in Rome. They collected taxes, and they had to collect more in order to get their wage, and then they could collect as much as they wanted in order to survive off of and thrive. And Zacchaeus became a rich, rich man because he kept stealing from other people. But when Jesus came into his town, he saw Jesus. He actually kind of undignified himself. He climbed a tree to see Jesus. And Jesus comes to him, seeing the eagerness and the hunger that he has for God's word. He tells Zacchaeus to come down and we're going to your house. And listen to Zacchaeus' response in verse 8. Zacchaeus, a thief, a guy who has stolen his whole life, who everything he has is because he has taken from other people. He says this, but Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, look, I'll give half my possessions to the poor, Lord. And if I've extorted anything from anyone, I'll pay back 4 times as much. He's saying, I'm going to give all my money away. Everything I've taken illegally, I'm giving it all back. I'm the kingdom I built, of everything I said none of it mattered in the face, in the glory of an eternal God. And for us today, when we look upon the face of Jesus, when we reflect on the glory of our God, here's the stirring it needs to cause in our hearts. Are we done with stealing? Are we done with taking away from other people? Are we done taking away from our jobs? Are we done taking away from our God? Are we ready to cut that off? To renounce that money, to renounce those possessions and said, God, with the direction you go, I'll follow. Because your salvation is worth it. Whether my kingdom here is big or small. Because I know I have a greater purpose in you. My prayer is that God would highlight the idols, highlight the theft in your life, and you can lay it at his feet, and salvation can come to your house today.